Imagine it's a Tuesday morning. Nothing special about it. You're sitting at your kitchen table, coffee going cold, scrolling through your bank account the way most people do. Not to plan anything, just to check that nothing has gone wrong. The balance says 2,340. It was 2,040 last week too. It will probably say 2,340 next week. Money comes in, money leaves. The number stays roughly the same, and somewhere underneath that routine, there's a feeling you've learned not to look at directly, not panic, not quite. Just a low, steady pressure. Like something is slightly off, and you can't point to exactly what. This is where the story begins. Not with a crisis, not with a revelation, just a Tuesday, and a number that never moves. Now imagine that on that same Tuesday, almost by accident, you set up an automatic transfer, $100, every month, into an index fund you barely understand, attached to an account you almost forgot you opened. You don't celebrate it. You don't tell anyone. You finish your coffee, close the app, and go to work. It feels like nothing. And for a long time, that's exactly what it is. At first, nothing changes. Month 1, the account shows $100. Month 2, it shows $201, maybe $202 if the market moved slightly in your favor. Month 3, somewhere around $304. You check it occasionally, the way you might check on a plant you're not sure you're watering correctly. It's alive. That's about all you can say. There's no dramatic growth. No moment where you feel like something is happening. Just a small number, getting slightly less small, in an account that exists quietly in the background of your actual life. This is the part most people quit. Not because they run out of money. Not because the strategy stops working. But because nothing feels like it's working. The brain is wired to respond to feedback, and $304 is not feedback. It's barely a rounding error compared to most people's monthly expenses. The brain files it under irrelevant and starts looking for reasons to redirect that $100 towards something that feels more real. A dinner out, a streaming subscription, something that produces an immediate sensation. And for most people, that's exactly what happens. The transfer gets paused, then canceled, then forgotten. The account closes, the experiment ends, and the balance on the checking account stays at 2,340. But let's say you don't quit. Not because you're especially disciplined. Not because you read the right book or found the right motivation. Just because the transfer is automatic, and canceling it requires steps you haven't gotten around to yet. Sometimes inertia is the only strategy that works. By month 6, you have roughly $610 sitting in that account. The market has moved, some months up, some months flat, one month briefly down, which briefly made you feel like this was all a mistake. But you didn't do anything, you just watched it recover. And somewhere in that watching, something small began to shift. Not in the account, in you. You start checking the account differently, less nervously. More like checking the weather. Not because you control it, but because it's useful to know. You notice the difference between a day the market is down 1.2% and a day it's down 3.8%. And you notice that you feel differently about those two numbers than you did 6 months ago. You're developing fluency in something you used to treat as a foreign language. The numbers are starting to have texture. A year passes. Your account holds somewhere around $1,260, assuming the market has averaged its historical behavior. Not life-changing, but real. Real in a way it wasn't before, because you remember the Tuesday when the balance was zero. You remember what $2,340 felt like when it was the only number in your financial life. And now there are two numbers, the one that barely moves, and the one that is slowly, undeniably becoming something. Here is the first thing most people never understand about money. The early years are not about return, they're about behavior. The market will return roughly what it has always returned. That's not the variable. You are the variable. Whether you keep going when it feels pointless, whether you panic when the balance drops, whether you redirect the $100 when life gets expensive, which it always does, the money is almost secondary. What's actually being built in year 1 is not a portfolio. It's a pattern, a version of yourself who does this automatically, without drama, without constant reevaluation. That version of yourself is worth more than any specific return. Year 2, the automatic transfer continues. Your life looks largely the same from the outside. Same job, roughly. Same apartment or close to it. But you've done something quietly unusual. You've gone 12 months without touching the account. Not because it was easy. There were moments. A car repair. A medical bill that came out of nowhere. A month where the $100 felt genuinely painful. But the account stayed. And now it holds around $2,600. There's a number that finance people talk about, called the market's historical average annual return. For a broad index fund tracking the total market, it sits somewhere around 7% after adjusting for inflation, though in any given year it might be 22% or negative 18%. The average smooths out the chaos, and that average, applied consistently over time, produces something that feels almost unfair when you first encounter it. At $2,600, you haven't felt it yet. The compound interest on $2,600 at 7% is $182. That's a nice dinner, it's not a life change. But the math doesn't stay this quiet. Year 3, the account crosses $4,000 for the first time. It happens on a random Wednesday. You notice it the way you might notice a traffic light turning green, not with emotion, just as information. But there's something subtle underneath that. A stability you didn't have before. The $2,340 in your checking account feels different now that it exists alongside $4,000 in another account. You're not wealthy, but you're no longer entirely exposed. There's a layer between you and disaster that wasn't there 3 years ago. This is where something changes. Not externally, internally. You start making slightly different decisions without consciously trying to. You pass on a purchase not because you can't afford it, but because the thing doesn't feel worth it. You notice the difference between spending that adds to your life and spending that just fills time. These aren't dramatic philosophical realizations. They're quiet shifts in judgment. The kind that happen when your relationship with money changes from anxious to strategic. When you stop reacting to money and start thinking about it. Year 4. Somewhere around $5,500 in the account. The compounding is still small, maybe $385 in interest and returns on top of your contributions this year. But you've now contributed $4,800 yourself, and the account holds $5,500, which means the market has added $700 to your effort without you doing anything except not quitting. That gap, between what you put in and what's actually there, is going to become the most important number in this story. This is the second thing most people miss. The gap is the point. The contributions are just the fuel. The gap is the engine. And right now the engine is small, but it's running. Year 5, halfway. The account is approaching $7,000. If you lined up everyone who started this experiment 5 years ago, and there were thousands of them, millions even, who read the same article or watched the same video and felt the same temporary motivation, the group has thinned dramatically. Most of them stopped in year 1. Some made it to year 2. A handful reached year 3. The ones still going at year 5 are a small, quiet group, and they share almost nothing in common except one thing. They automated it and they left it alone. The market has had 2 bad years in that 5-year window. One of them, the account dropped from about $5,800 to roughly $5,100. That's $700 gone in a few weeks. For someone new to this, that feels like failure. It feels like evidence. And it is evidence, just not of what most people think. It's evidence that the market is volatile, which was always true, which was always known, which changes nothing about the long-term direction. The people still in the account at year 5 have either learned this, or they were too busy to check during the drop. Both work. Year 6. Around $8,700. The interest and returns this year alone generated something close to $600 without any action on your part. That's money that appeared because money was already there. That concept, money generating money, sounds simple when you say it, but it doesn't feel simple until you see your own name next to the number. Year 6 is also when something shifts in how you talk about the future. Not publicly necessarily, but privately, in your own thinking. The 10-year mark starts to feel real rather than theoretical. You can actually see the endpoint now. 4 more years, 48 more $100 transfers. And the account, which has grown at a pace that felt meaningless for the first few years, is now growing at a pace that feels different. Not fast, but visible. Distinctly, quietly visible. Year 7. Somewhere between $10,500 and $11,000. You've crossed 5 figures. That crossing feels more significant than it should, mathematically. The difference between $9,900 and $10,100 is $200. But there's something psychological about 5 figures that 4 figures never had. It feels like a different category. Not wealthy, but a different relationship with the word wealth than the one you had when you were staring at $2,340. Here is something worth pausing on. If you had never started this, if you'd kept the $100 each month and spent it, or let it sit in checking, your checking account would probably still be around $2,340. Maybe a little higher, maybe a little lower, depending on your expenses in any given year. The $100 you moved each month would have been absorbed by life without a trace. You wouldn't feel its absence. You wouldn't remember where it went. It would simply be gone. And the Tuesday you're sitting at would look almost identical to the Tuesday 7 years ago. Same coffee going cold, same low-grade financial pressure, same number that never moves. Instead, you have $11,000. And the Tuesday feels different. Year 8. The account holds close to $13,500. The compounding is accelerating. Though accelerating is a strange word for something this quiet. The gains this year from growth on existing investments alone, before counting new contributions, are somewhere around $900. You contributed $200. The account grew by more than $2,000. The gap between what you put in and what you have is now more than $3,000 and widening every month. This is the third thing that matters, and it's the one that sounds like a cliché until you live it. Time is the ingredient you cannot buy. The person who started this at 22 and is now 30 is in a different position than the person who waited until 30 to start. Not because they're smarter, not because they earned more, because they gave the compound interest 8 more years to work, and those 8 years, in the mathematics of exponential growth, are worth more than most people intuitively grasp. The first years feel worthless. They're not. They're the ones that multiply everything that comes after. Year 9. Just over $16,000. You've now contributed $10,800 of your own money over 9 years. The account holds $16,000. The market and compound growth have added more than $5,000 that you never had to earn, save, or sacrifice for. It appeared because you stayed. That's it. That's the entire story of that $5,000. You stayed. There's a specific moment that happens around this time. Not for everyone, not at exactly this year, but somewhere in the late stretch, where you stop thinking about the account as a savings account and start thinking about it as a foundation. It's not retirement, it's not freedom, but it's the beginning of something structural. Something that, if you keep going beyond 10 years, begins to change the actual architecture of your financial life. The account isn't just holding money anymore, it's holding options. The option to take a lower-paying job you actually want. The option to handle an emergency without debt. The option to say no to things that used to feel mandatory. Options are invisible until you need them. And the person who's been doing this for 9 years has options they haven't had to use yet. That's exactly the point. Year 10. The final transfer clears. The account sits at somewhere between $17,300 and $17,500, depending on what the market did in the final months. You've put in exactly $12,000 over 10 years. $100 a month, 120 months. The account holds $17,400. The difference, $5,400, is money you never earned, never saved, never sacrificed for. It materialized through the simple act of leaving the previous money alone long enough for it to grow. This is the moment to hold still for a second. Not because $17,400 is a fortune. It isn't. Not because you can retire. You can't. But because you are now a fundamentally different financial entity than the person who sat at that kitchen table 10 years ago. That person had $2,340 and a feeling they'd learned not to look at directly. This person has $2,340 in checking. That number, somehow, still roughly the same, and $17,400 in an account that represents a decade of quiet, unspectacular, remarkably effective behavior. And here's what's true about that $17,400 that isn't obvious until you understand compound growth. It isn't finished, not remotely. If you leave it completely alone, no new contributions, no withdrawals, just the same average market return, that $17,400 becomes roughly $35,000 in another 10 years. In 20 more years, it's closer to $67,000. In 30 more years, just from what already exists, just from the work you already did, it approaches $130,000. The 10 years you just completed weren't the destination, they were the ignition. Most people spend their lives waiting for the moment when investing makes sense, when they earn more, when the debt is cleared, when things settle down. And things never settle down because life is not a settling down kind of system. The moment never arrives. And the years that passed while waiting for the right moment are the years that would have done the most work. You didn't wait for the right moment. You picked a Tuesday, a completely ordinary Tuesday when nothing felt ready and $100 felt too small to matter. And you started anyway. The account doesn't know what Tuesday it is. It doesn't know you were unsure. It doesn't know the car broke down in year 2. Or that you almost canceled the transfer in year 4. It only knows that the money kept coming and it kept working, and year after year the gap between what you put in and what exists grew wider, grew quieter, grew into something that now sits in the background of your life the way the $2,340 used to, except that this number moves. This number grows. This number, unlike that one, has somewhere to go. You check the account one more time. Not nervously, the way you check weather. $17,400. You close the app. You finish your coffee. It's still Tuesday. Nothing looks different. But something is.